struggled with this. We didn't feel we had the right group membership in terms of representatives from the countries that we're talking about. So with that caveat, maybe we'll do sequential numbers now, starting with the highest. There's no group 9. Is there? We still got group 8 or not? Okay, well, let's start with group 7 this time. Oh, and I've been asked that the rapporteurs come to this microphone because the people online can only see the back of your head and they're not, don't feel as involved as they should.
Hi, I wasn't totally prepared to go first.
You can get near the microphone.
But that's fine. I mean, I think we came up with some like very basic things that every study needs. That's not really even limited to low and middle income countries in some sense, right? I mean, you need a way to, first of all, you need to have the product available and accessible to the population, and you need people who are using it to be able to do the assessments. And then, of course, you need the ability to validate and confirm and track vaccination status. You need surveillance programs that are in hand that are able to provide, valid data on and complete data on outcomes. You also need to have access to data and all the ethical approvals that go to that, and understanding, the privacy concerns that could be associated with that. And then you also need, I think, very importantly, depending on, the type of study that you're running, the community buy-in and the government buy-in, and you need to have the right stakeholders at the table to ensure that your study can be successful. And so, I mean, we're talking about these a lot and like what's needed in lower and middle income countries. And so an idea that we had come up with and actually started to talk about yesterday was, we were thinking about the example of Israel and how, a certain, vaccine company had really partnered with that government to have the doses there and to set up an infrastructure and kind of have a strategy of setting up like a center of excellence. I mean, and I know that's something that wasn't set up overnight for the purpose of the COVID vaccine. I mean, this was something that was worked on for a long time. So is that also something that we need, in certain settings, certain places in certain lower and middle income countries, that there's already some level of infrastructure, a level of government and community buy-in that we can set up centers of excellence or evidence hubs that will allow us to build the infrastructure and things that are needed for the needs for all the different vaccines. So perhaps something that we can discuss as a group.
Would that be like for a pandemic preparedness? Because if it's the Lassa fever outbreak, you don't know where that's going to occur next.
Right.
So is it as part of a sort of global pandemic preparedness? Because it was obvious yesterday that there's a big missing bit of information from low and middle income countries about effectiveness and safety.
Yeah.
Because of the lack of infrastructure.
I mean, what I think is that there should be, it could be for that, but it could be for any other things, right? And so what I would envision is a sort of mapping process where we really think about our needs and the different locations where things are happening and the type of centers that we want, right? And then there's certain places that we know have a certain level of infrastructure that is already set up and has kind of shown, willingness to be a sort of hub in some ways. Maybe Kilifi in Kenya is an example, or with the work that we've done in Brazil. I mean, I can tell you that their, database infrastructures are very close to being something that can be used very efficiently, starting to go towards, I don't think we'd ever reach the level of the UK, but you start to go towards a level where you can start to use those data. So I would imagine like a sort of, multilateral like mapping process where we could think strategically of where we would want to put such hubs.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I mean, that would be a tangible that could come out of this meeting. Okay, was that group 8 or group 7? It was group 7. 6.
Hybrid group. Yeah, I mean, similar points raised in ours, and we had colleagues from Nigeria on our group as well, just to give the perspective from one LMIC. But I think the main thing we touched upon was, digitalization of data platform, data collection being key, sustaining the things that were built in the pandemic, sustaining the vaccine registers and linkage that was developed, and, and more use of mobile technology and common data specifications. I think that was one of the sort of key things that we said, was needed from an infrastructure point of view. And, sustaining, platform trials that were built during the pandemic and, extending them to be more pragmatic and hybrid trials. And, that worked well. And that's something that should be sustained. Harmonization of data specifications being a big challenge, particularly, from the Nigeria point of view, and, data management not being coordinated. So that's a challenge, but again, we don't have the solutions here, but they're the things that we do need to address from an infrastructure point of view. And of course, funding, is obviously the common theme there, is that we need more sustainability to deliver, these standards. We talked about whether there's any, this is just a question really, whether there's any scope for, low to middle income countries getting involved in some of the initiatives like Odyssey-like initiatives where you have these federated data platforms, can that be built? That was more of a question. And then just a general issue, again, just from the Nigeria perspective, is there is an element of, issues over acceptance and mistrust of vaccines that, haven't been developed in collaboration with some African countries or where trials haven't been done, which obviously makes it even more important to generate real-world data there. But I think the key point we were making is that having that real-world data wouldn't necessarily solve that problem of acceptance and mistrust, and there needs to be more collaboration with these countries, from the beginning. I don't know whether I've articulated that well, Osagi. Feel free to add to any of that if you want, but hopefully that was the gist of what we said.
So you see, identification of the challenges, but the how to address them a little bit more difficult.
I said I didn't have all the answers, Liz.
Or any answers.
Funding.
I know, I think this is our problem we're grappling with. We know what, what needs to be done, but how to be done.
Yeah. So apologies, I didn't come with the solutions there.
Thanks, Phil. Group 5.
So in group 5, we also discussed around the building infrastructures around digital transformation. And also what we found important is the guidelines for data sharing. And we talk about the example of South Africa sharing data on coronavirus variant and how it was last to receive COVID-19 vaccine. So. And also, as the previous group mentioned about the access and availability of the product, that's important to conduct these studies. And we also talk about the key role of WHO. Since if we see that for clinical trial, to conduct clinical trial in Africa, there is already WHO is playing a major role. So maybe we could leverage from that, and also the WHO's initiative to designate the maturity level of health authorities, that could be useful as well. And sustainable funding mechanism, we cannot forget that, because we will need money to conduct these studies. And also experience in conducting prior clinical trials that can help in building capacity for these real-world evidence studies in these countries. And last but not the least, the communication and training of the individuals who are needed in conducting these studies is also very much important. So that's all we discussed.
You mentioned the South African data sharing. What
Yeah.
was the I'm not familiar with
So
that event.
what we are discussing is that one of the South African variant we talk about, it came from South Africa, right? And also South Africa shared a lot of data in the beginning, but it was not the first country to receive the vaccines to protect the people. So data sharing also, it has to also mean that the country should receive the vaccine.
Okay.
But it was not globally coordinated. That's what
Okay.
we touched a little bit on that as well.
Thank you. Group 4, Nick.
Okay. One was a little bit of a step back at the beginning, just to highlight where we were talking about levels of emergency declaration and actually whether it's sort of doing whether or not the trials are required for licensure. We had considered that this could occur at a regional level, actually. And I mean, I suppose we're thinking about, for examples like Ebola outbreaks or the Sudan Ebola more recently, that those levels of emergency might work well earlier on at a regional level, maybe before a global declaration's made. So that could be considered. So, and that, I think, probably is quite relevant to the LMICs. So we did quite a lot of discussion about what's, in terms of then going on to get that real world data, what might be possible. And we were considering the demographic health and surveillance sites that they're already in existence, and whether they may, some of them were sort of set up around trials, but actually could be also being used, as some of them have, for post-licensure surveillance and for doing these sorts of studies. I think that sort of builds into what Bob was mentioning about these sort of landscape surveys to find out which of these sites actually do look like they could be used, and actually making sure that at least the funding's there to keep some of them active, so that they're there available. Depending on, obviously, there may or may not be that the outbreak or epidemic or pandemic occurs in those locations, but at least you've got some that are there if that is the case. And if not those, then having the potential to do things like the cohort event monitoring, which perhaps could be set up more easily, more widely, if you're thinking about using things like mobile phone reporting, and it would be potentially helpful to pilot that sort of now on something to see whether that really could work. I was particularly wondering about how that works in terms of vaccine and unvaccinated groups being monitored, because I'm aware of the sort of active surveillance within vaccinated groups being used to report back, but the idea of using it for safety, really, but the idea of using it for effectiveness, I'm not aware that's been tried, but maybe it could be trialed. And then we talked about the global hospital networks, and this feeds into what the global vaccine data network are being set up to do, and whether that expanding that more into other countries, and there's other networks as well, that having those hospitals available to report cases and having them doing sequencing to identify the endpoints that you want, having that available, and that is there for some, and that could be expanded. We didn't really get into what you do about vaccination status, because we obviously need that. Self-reporting is not the ideal way to go. So how could these hospital sites also be in areas where you can get hold of that vaccine data? I don't think we'd certainly not solve that one, but it would need to be solved. Yes, I mean, we were sort of thinking, with the current resources is obviously an issue, but what resource is currently available to do some of this would be useful to understand. and maybe part of the landscape analysis could sort of look into that. And we talked about the CEPI pathogens and the sites that they're looking at for trials and whether they could be used also for real world. And then the last thing was sort of away from LMIC, was really talking about other countries where maybe we didn't get great reports, where the COVID effectiveness, where there were some holes for some vaccines in some regions, and they're not necessarily from from the LMICs, but from other regions where things could be improved, or to have where maybe the infrastructure is there, but more could be done. And the countries where things are looking like they may get there. So we just heard about Brazil. There's quite a few other countries where they actually have in the end done studies, but maybe they took longer. And that not losing that capacity that they did for actually getting some COVID VE and having that maintained. I think that's everything. Bob, you had lots of things. I maybe let Bob chip in because I may not have covered everything exactly.
Yeah, no, Nick did a great job. I think in terms of this question of sustainability, what we thought is that as part of the landscape survey, there is in fact already a lot of different funders. So, for example, the US NIH funds the HIV vaccine trial network and HIV prevention network, and many of those are in LMICs with kind of joint protocol with a lot of clinical trial experience, a lot of community engagement, ethics, etc. So those are already ongoing that we could potentially piggyback onto.
Yeah, in relation to the risk assessment, I think that's a nice idea. If there were agreed criteria or thresholds which, if met, would allow proceeding to a rollout without formal efficacy data, where would that be decided in sort of, because WHO already has this risk assessment, if there's a viral hemorrhagic fever outbreak, they do the country assessment, neighboring country, regional assessments. Is it a sort of a WHO or is it a regulatory?
WHO regionally or the regional regulators? Again, Bob might want to chip in.
Yeah. So our feeling was that if you waited till WHO to declare something as a pandemic, it's too late.
Okay. Yeah.
If we really needed,
something that's more reactive.
Yeah, we needed stop it at the national and regional level.
And that would be a regulatory?
Well, what we think is that if we could plan ahead of time with different scenarios and perhaps get that buy-in on a global basis with WHO and CEPI and others, that then would allow the local public health authorities, once they've had those check marks of that new emergent pathogen, that gives them the backbone needed to make a hard decision, saying that already this is already approved by others, by WHO and others, but allow the local authorities to act in a more timely manner.
Yeah, that sounds a plausible beginnings of a roadmap, I think, that would result in timely action. Thanks, Nick. Group 3.
Okay, so I'll be quite quick because I think most has already been said. I think our first disclosure is no one in the group actually works in a low middle income country, so we are limited by this fact. I'll say maybe some keywords because I heard these come up with every group. So the first one is the mapping of infrastructures. I think there was a mentioning of mapping of funding. We didn't think of this one. We were more in infrastructures such as local expertise as well. That's often forgotten, and laboratory capacity, along with all the other essential parts of infrastructures. I think sustainability was a key word, again, for funding, but also for the infrastructures that are put in place. So we think when we put them in place, they really have to have public health interests as well in mind for the long term. So I think WHO recently has, well, in their vision for the future, they're saying stopping the vertical programs such as polio, but really has to be integrated and multi-use. So I think we have to integrate this also for the studies we'll be doing. It really has to have public health capacity building and interest locally. And when you think of public health interest, you can also think about the community needs. We know from a lot of experience in these countries that you always need community need and interest for them to work, of course, for these data collections to work at the source. Another interesting point was that maybe in countries with basic regulatory capacity or even local production, at least for the first time being, there may be a more self-interest and so motivation and investment to start working on these projects. Then another couple of keywords would be, of course, they keep coming up: communication, training, maybe standardization, networks, what's already there. Let's not, let's use what's already there. Public-private partnerships came up as well. And of course, the last one was funding. We don't have an answer either. We had the proposal of a pandemic money fund, the future PMF International. That's as far as we got. Thank you. Sorry, I don't know if I forgot anything from the group.
Yeah, I mean, the funding would be needed in some cases to make large batches of vaccine for use in this approach. There is risk for the manufacturer. And I mean, I don't know how CEPI plans, to get the vaccine in 100 days and who would fund that. But getting vaccine to deploy. Did somebody going to ask how? Did somebody answer? No. Vaccine availability is an issue for rapid deployment and having enough stuff quickly enough. Okay, group 2.
Well, I'm going to have to be quite honest because I feel like all the other groups have done a very good job, and I'm not really sure that we have any additional things to add because, as was beautifully done in the last presentation, all of these keywords also came up in our discussions. I would say that maybe something different that we did talk a little bit about was the different roles of African CDC as well as the regulators, and how we would really like to see them take on these responsibilities. Knowing that we're asking a lot of agencies that are already taking quite a lot on, and we did have a member from the Nigerian contingent here today in our group, and we talked a lot about the continued reliance on the West or the high-income countries, and how we need that, but it makes it very difficult for a lot of these agencies to work within their own agency, actually, so to say. And so we discussed that quite a bit. I mean, how do you break that? How do you break that chain? I do think a lot of our discussions were a bit similar to maybe Bob and Nick's, probably because we had that vaccine safety representation in that group for me. So we also talked a lot about mobile apps and potentially doing this. We talked about whether or not we can do it, with citizen engagement through mobile apps versus actually more a shoe leather network of physicians in hospitals that would do reporting. So a lot of our discussions were paralleled that group, I think.
Thanks. Nigeria's got maturity level 3, I think, for its regulatory agency. The initiative by WHO to bring other African countries up in the existence of a pan-African, a little bit like the EMA, are all moves that would facilitate this approach, I think, in low and middle income countries. So, last one, group
Last
one.
one, group one, yes. I think there's not a lot to add because I think a lot of groups before us captured a lot already. But what we just wanted to reiterate is maybe that the maturity level of the low middle income countries in respect to infrastructure, they're not the same. There's different levels, and I think that has to be taken into account. Brazil was mentioned, where the databases are actually quite good, already established, and you could actually do a real-world effectiveness study in that case. It's just a matter that maybe the data quality needs to be a little bit improved, and whereas on the other side you have sub-Saharan Africa, where you need to foster and build databases. And Claire was quite vocal, I'm not sure where she's sitting now, all the way in the back, quite vocal on what is actually needed in order to get the data that is on at the sites in paper-based form in order to get that digitalized and into electronic databases. And in addition to that, we talked a lot about capacity building, where we said training of the sites is essential, and we need to get the knowledge on the ground to the people who are actually in the countries. And we also said that we would start with Sentinel sites, for instance, and build on the Sentinel sites and build then a network of sites that could then, in the end, be ready to conduct such studies. We also mentioned international networking and mentoring programs, and there are, for instance, the EMA Open Initiative, where EMA is having their discussions with, for instance, participation of low-middle-income countries. For instance, Anvisa is going to participate in consultations with EMA. Maybe that is something that can be rolled out to FDA as well, and I think that needs to be fostered much more than it's being done now. We talked about lab capacity and standardization of assays, which is essential when you're looking at effectiveness data. And I think last but not least, the political will of the countries that we're targeting. And we have to have the countries on board, and we have to engage with the countries quite early on. I think I'm looking at my team, not sure whether I captured everything or whether I missed something. All done, okay.
Okay. I mean, there's quite a lot. There's quite a lot identified of what is needed. Perhaps a little bit less of how to get it, and the recurrent problem of where's the money. What's the next on? I don't have the actual agenda. Is it further discussion of this in the plenary or what? Is it lunch or? Yeah, I think, I mean, maybe come up to the microphone and, as conference organizers, give us an idea of. I mean, not on the agenda necessarily, but.
I mean, of course, it was very lovely to see you all again, but I don't think this is the objective of this meeting, right? I mean, of course, it's good to exchange ideas, but I always like to think about the next steps. And maybe, I mean, for me, I think there's two interesting ideas. And the one idea, it was the previous breakout session where we talked about efficacy and effectiveness, and that it's all getting very blurry and when we could use what. Maybe that's worthwhile to think a bit further and to write this out in a concept paper or something that we can have the ball rolling.
There was Hector's very practical suggestion of actually doing a review of where this principle or something close to this principle has already been applied successfully, and also trying to identify the criteria, possibly for different levels at which you might do a deployment with some randomization, without. I mean, I think those require words on paper and volunteers, really.
Yeah, I think that's a worthwhile paper to write, right? I think.
I mean, were you envisaging a conference report anyway? Because I see these as possibly separate outputs.
Yeah, but for me, that's not what's in a. I mean, I never read conference reports, or rarely read conference reports. I more saw it as a more mature paper, like having not just elaborated meeting minutes, but.
Well, the objective of each IABS meeting, and particularly this one also, is to write the conclusions down write down what we discussed, and then to share it with some participants in order to assure that it corresponds what have been said, and then what is the way forward. So depends on the conclusions that we will make, and of course there is need for more in order to come to more practical recommendations. So that's where I would suggest to go. So let's look at the report first. And is the report, is it just a report, or can it be, as you suggested, more a position paper that we have already some ideas where we where we see a certain direction. So this is open, but I feel quite a lot for a little bit more engagement, a little bit more than just a report. So
yes,
with proposals already.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it's not as firm enough as a roadmap, but I think it's more than just, oh, we discussed this and wouldn't it be nice if.
Yeah,
I think there's been some quite concrete
and then probably,
proposals about next steps.
And then probably, why not a next meeting where we go really to firm recommendations, because it needs some time to mature, I think. So many things has been said here. So I can imagine that. For example, the discussion we had or was raised on the phase 3, I can imagine that we don't have consensus yet on that. So what has to be done to have consensus, and under which circumstances, etc., etc. So this is only one example.
Yeah, I mean, Hector, when I said I thought our group had agreed that, COVID, with the benefit of hindsight, could have been rolled out according to, he objected, not because of the quality of the real world evidence, but because of the kickback from, the vaccine opposers. And that is a big issue in implementing this.
And then the low and middle income countries, of course, have to be realistic. The funding comes always back, and who does what, and et cetera, et cetera.
Anybody from the floor got a view on the next steps and output from this meeting?
Probably we get all a little bit tired. We need some energy and lunch. If there is, I would say, if there's 1 or 2 suggestions before the lunch, let's do it now. Otherwise, we have lunch and we are expected to be back at 2 o'clock. Anyone who likes to make a last? Yes, Hector.
Hector.
Okay.
Just if, in case this is useful, I think one output could be, the conclusions of what we discussed. Of course, another one is something Kat did mention, which is, I do think that creating a database of experiences in, let's call it, accelerated approval emergency use authorizations, not only for COVID, but for whichever vaccines we have experience with, would go a long way into creating a wealth of arguments for future regulators in whichever country will be needed, because we don't have that. I have not seen any paper that has collected the meningitis C example, the HIV example, the monoclonal antibodies example, and I could go on, and also the emergency use authorization pathways from different countries in different situations for COVID vaccines, for emergency use authorization of a booster, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think that would be useful. The other useful thing is, we mentioned real-world evidence studies. Let's say, assuming we pass the hurdle of data in phase 2 studies for safety, at least to exclude an incidence of 1 in 1,000. So at least 6,000 people or whatever. Then we get into the, we need some data surrogates suggestive of efficacy, and we got into that discussion. But then what could be the next steps once we get there? And while discussing the COVID example and Nick's mention and Liz mentioned of could we have gotten away with real world evidence as confirmatory for COVID directly? And based on what I have lived, my own bias is, I think no, I think we would have failed because many of the observational studies said different things at different times as well, in different areas and in different countries. And anybody could have used as argument one lousy study or one good unlucky study to derail the whole effort. And then in one of the groups, in our group at least, but another group mentioned the same thing. We mentioned pragmatic trials, which is a safer, more hybrid approach that I think could have been more successful in almost any situation, because you randomize to administer the vaccine and then you let the system, whatever system is, receive the cases and the hospitalizations and etc. You already randomize at the beginning, then you only need to count the hospitalized people and know whether they were vaccinated or not. It's much more, it's easier to get credibility out of a hybrid approach like a pragmatic trial. So all those reflections are of interest for the conclusions of this meeting. I'm not trying to push in anybody's throat, pragmatic trials. What I'm thinking is, based on the discussion, that could be one of the avenues. But I also insist on if the meeting would like to make a call for volunteers to present, to include experiences from successful authorizations of vaccines or other products. Monoclonals should not be excluded because it's a beautiful example, to create that wealth of data that we don't have. That could also be helpful as reference, but that's it.
Yeah, who should they send them? I mean, I think we all came across examples that we'd either forgotten about or didn't realize it was an example of that. I mean, who should people send them to collate, and then possibly somebody take the initiative to knock it into more of a report or paper, discussion or position paper to you?
Or to
I thought we put
P95 colleague.
what?
Or a P95.
To P95.
Oh, to P. We got the email address of.
Yeah.
Is there a generic email address?
No. I mean, I will identify someone, but not my mailbox.
Sorry, I can't hear you.
We will identify someone, but not my mailbox.
Okay.
So, with all these rich ideas, we have stuff to think about during the lunch. So I invite you to the lunch now. And let's come back at 2:00.